The only way a woman like her was going to survive a world like that was to stop pretending she didn't already understand it. Lena had known how to read a ledger before she knew how to read people. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't smile at you over breakfast and call the debt collector while you were still washing the dishes. She was 26 years old when her uncle sold her debt to a man named Voss. Not the Voss in her files, not any name she recognized. This one went by Kane, just Kane. The way you say a city name or a weather system. Something that arrives without asking. Her uncle Prentice had run a small import business out of Sudbury for 11 years. Lena had kept his books for the last 4 of them, ever since she'd dropped out of Laurier in her second year because the tuition check bounced and no one told her, until the registrar pulled her out of a Thursday morning lecture and handed her a letter in a yellow envelope. She didn't cry. She went home, made tea, and started calculating how long the savings would last. Not long, as it turned out. Prentice had taken her in after her mother died, or said he did. What he actually did was give her a cot in the back office and a job that paid just enough that she couldn't leave without ending up with nothing. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself that every year for 4 years, standing in that same back office, under the same flickering fluorescent tube that Prentice kept saying he'd replace. He never replaced it. She found the discrepancy in March, right after the ice started breaking up on Ramsey Lake, and the city was making that particular wet, grey sound it makes in early spring when it can't decide if winter is over. She was reconciling the accounts receivable against the shipping logs, and the numbers didn't line up. Not by a little, by a lot. $340,000, give or take. She printed the pages, put them in a folder, and sat with them for 2 days. She didn't confront Prentice. She wasn't stupid. Instead, she started looking for a way out, updating a resume she hadn't touched in years, emailing 2 old contacts from university, price-checking basement apartments in Barrie. She was in the middle of all that when the men showed up. There were 3 of them. They came on a Wednesday afternoon, when Prentice was supposedly at a supplier meeting in Toronto. They weren't loud about it. They came in through the back, which meant someone had given them a key, and they were very polite in the way that certain kinds of dangerous people are polite when they already know how things are going to go. The one who spoke first had a Montreal accent and a grey suit that cost more than Lena made in 4 months. He told her that her uncle owed money to a man named Kane, that the debt had been structured as a personal guarantee, that there were complications. Lena looked at the folder on her desk, then she looked at the man in the grey suit. "How much?" she said, he told her. She didn't flinch. She was good at that. She'd had a lot of practice not flinching. And what does any of that have to do with me? He smiled, and it didn't reach anything. Your uncle made certain arrangements, you're part of them. She found out later what Prentice had done. He'd borrowed against the business, against everything, including the employment contracts of anyone currently on payroll. And when Kane's people had called the debt, Prentice had offered them something he apparently thought was worth more than $340,000. He'd offered them her. Not her specifically, the man in the grey suit explained. Her skills, her discretion, her access to the books. Kane's organization had a problem with their financial infrastructure, and someone had told someone that Prentice's niece was the kind of woman who could solve problems with a spreadsheet and knew how to keep her mouth shut. Prentice had sold her labor like it was inventory. She thought about the cot in the back office, the fluorescent light, 4 years of holding someone else's roof over her head by making herself useful and small and grateful enough to stay. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. The man in the grey suit looked at her steadily. "The debt becomes yours. Personally, the business collapses. You're listed as an officer of record, which means the CRA gets interested. We've already spoken to the lawyers." She closed the folder. "When do I start?" she said. They drove her to Toronto in a black SUV with tinted windows and leather seats that were warmer than anywhere she'd slept in 2 years. She watched the highway unspool behind them through the rear window and told herself to catalogue everything. The exits, the distances, the faces she could see. A woman who understood ledgers understood one thing above everything else: always know exactly where you stand. Kane's building was in the financial district, which she hadn't expected. Not a warehouse, not a compound somewhere outside the city. An actual glass tower with a doorman and a lobby with a marble floor and a security desk where they signed her in with a lanyard and a printed badge like she was there for a job interview, which, she supposed, she was. She was taken to the 34th floor and left in a room that looked like a boardroom. Oval table, 12 chairs, a wall of windows facing the lake. The CN Tower sat in the frame of the glass like someone had placed it there deliberately. It was late afternoon, and the water was that specific pewter shade it gets when the clouds come low. She waited 40 minutes, she counted. Then the door opened and Kane walked in. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something louder, maybe. Something that announced itself. What she got was a man who moved quietly for someone his size. Mid-40s, she guessed, with the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, dark hair going silver at the temples, a scar that ran from his left jaw to just below his ear. He was wearing a charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and no tie, which somehow made him look more formal than the man in the grey suit had in his full ensemble. He sat down across from her and looked at her the way people look at contracts, reading the terms. "You found the shortfall in Prentice's books," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "How long did it take you?" The pattern was visible in about an hour, confirming it took 2 days. He nodded, slowly, like she'd said something he needed to file away. "And you didn't tell him?" "No. Why not?" She thought about how to answer that. The honest version, the version she hadn't said out loud yet, was that she'd known it wouldn't matter. That Prentice would find a way to make it her problem, her fault, her debt to carry. The kind of person who puts someone else's name on a liability doesn't react to accountability by accepting it. "Because I was looking for the exit first," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. The way you look at a chess piece that moves in an unexpected direction. "You're not going to be able to go back," he said. "You understand that?" "I understood that before I got in the car." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need someone who can manage the financial architecture of a complex organization. Payroll, procurement, inter-entity transfers, the clean and the less clean. Someone who can build systems that hold up under scrutiny but don't expose anything that shouldn't be exposed. Someone discreet." He paused. "Someone who has reasons to stay." "You mean someone you have leverage over?" "I mean someone with aligned interests." She looked at the lake through the window. It had gone darker, the pewter shade deepening toward iron. "I want a salary," she said. "Not an allowance. A salary, direct deposit, with benefits and a proper employment record. I want a place to live that isn't a cot. I want access to the accounts I'm managing so I can do the work properly. And I want a clause that says if you decide this arrangement is over, I walk with 6-month severance and a clean record." The room was very quiet. "That's a significant list of demands for someone in your position," he said. "I know what I'm worth," she said. "If you didn't think I was worth it, I wouldn't be here." Kane looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like he'd noted something in the margin. "All right," he said. "We'll put it in writing." She had her own apartment by the end of the week. 10th floor of a building in Liberty Village, with an actual bed and a kitchen that had more than a microwave and a hot plate. She stood at the window on the first night and looked at the city and thought, this is not safe, this is not freedom. But it is a step, and a step is what you take when you can't take more. She started work the following Monday. The financial infrastructure of Kane's organization was exactly as complicated as he'd implied, and significantly more chaotic than she'd hoped. There were 11 shell entities across 4 provinces, 3 of which hadn't filed returns in 2 years. The payroll system had been managed by 2 different people who didn't talk to each other, and the result was a web of overlapping records that would have made an auditor weep. There were transfers that went nowhere, accounts that existed only on paper, liabilities that had been quietly moved from one column to another in the hope that no one would ever look too closely. She looked too closely. It was the only way she knew how to work. Within 2 weeks, she had a clear picture of where everything stood. She built a new chart of accounts, restructured the inter-entity loans, and flagged 3 transactions that she was not going to touch without explicit instructions in writing. She wrote a 12-page memo outlining the risks in the current structure and what it would take to address them, formatted it the way she used to format academic papers, with footnotes and appendices, because if she was going to be meticulous, she was going to be meticulous all the way. She put it on Kane's desk at 8:30 on a Thursday morning. He called her in at 10. "You footnoted a money laundering concern," he said, holding the memo. "I flagged a structural irregularity with potential legal exposure," she said. "The footnote specifies the relevant provisions." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not afraid of me." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He set the memo down. "Most people who've worked for me don't produce documents that could theoretically be used in court. Most people who work for you probably don't know how to produce documents that could theoretically be used in court." Fair point. She looked at him steadily. "The irregularities I flagged represent a liability risk. If they surface during a review, and they will surface, these things always do, the exposure falls on whoever is managing the accounts, which is now me. So addressing them isn't just best practice, it's self-preservation." He tilted his head slightly. It was a gesture she'd seen twice before, the same one he'd made in the boardroom when she'd told him she'd understood the situation before she got in the car, like she'd moved in a direction he hadn't anticipated. "All right," he said, "fix it." She fixed it. Not all at once. These things couldn't be done all at once, without drawing exactly the kind of attention you were trying to avoid. But methodically, over several months, she rebuilt the financial structure of the organization into something that was cleaner and harder to pick apart. She created documentation trails that were real, instead of retroactively invented. She established proper controls. She built redundancy into the systems so that no single point of failure could bring the whole thing down. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. Numbers were the one language she'd never had to fight to learn. What she hadn't expected was to understand the rest of it as well. She sat in on meetings sometimes, when Kane wanted her there for questions about cost and feasibility. She listened more than she spoke, which was her nature, and because she listened, she started to understand the architecture of the operation beyond the financial layer. The alliances, the pressure points, the places where things were being held together with considerably less structural integrity than she'd first assumed. There was a supplier issue in early November that turned into a conflict with an organization out of Hamilton, and Lena sat in a cold room on a Thursday night and listened to 2 men argue about a debt settlement that had nothing to do with numbers but everything to do with pride, and at a certain point she said quietly that there was a third option neither of them had considered, and outlined it in about 90 seconds. Both men stared at her. Kane, who was sitting at the head of the table and had been watching her since she'd spoken, said, "Walk us through that again." She did. By the end of the month, the Hamilton problem was resolved. It cost less than either of the original options would have, and it didn't leave anyone with a reason to come back angry. Kane came to find her in her office the next afternoon. "You're not just an accountant," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up from her screen. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She was aware of him in the particular way she'd become aware of him over the months. The weight of his presence, the way a room reorganized itself slightly around him without anyone acknowledging it. "You could have left by now," he said. "You know that." She looked up. "I know," she said again. She hadn't left. She'd thought about it. She thought about it the way you think about a door you can see from across the room. It was there. She knew where it was. But she'd also started to see what she was building here, not just the accounts and the structures and the liability management, but something larger, a position, a kind of gravity. She wasn't a cot in a back office anymore. "What do you want?" he said. It was a different question than the ones he'd asked before, less like a negotiation and more like he actually wanted to know. She thought about it honestly. I want to not be owned, she said, by anyone, including this. He was quiet for a moment. Then that's the first thing you've said that I believe completely. She looked at him. He was standing in the light from the hallway, and she could see the scar on his jaw and the grey in his hair and the particular exhaustion that lived in his eyes. The exhaustion of a man who had been managing the weight of everything for a very long time without putting it down. She knew that exhaustion. She'd been carrying her own version of it since she was old enough to balance a checkbook. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee, and then you can tell me what's actually keeping you up." He looked startled. It was the first time she'd seen that expression on him. Then he sat down. She won't pretend it happened quickly, or cleanly, or without complications. This isn't that kind of story. What happened was slower and stranger and more practical than most people imagine. Two people who understood leverage and risk gradually discovering that they trusted each other in the particular way you trust someone who has seen the inside of your books and not run. By spring, he'd started consulting her on decisions that went beyond the financial. By summer, she had a seat in the room that no one questioned anymore. By the fall, they had a conversation that lasted most of a Saturday night, in which very little was said directly, but everything was understood. And at the end of it, he looked at her and said, "This isn't going to be simple." "Nothing I've ever done has been simple," she said. "You'd be in it completely. You understand what that means." She understood what that meant. She'd been in it for over a year already. The difference was that now she'd be in it as something other than a ledger that walked around. "I want the same agreement as before," she said, "in writing. My name on everything I earn, not as a dependent, not as a courtesy, as a partner. And I want the clause that says if this stops working, I still walk." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're negotiating again," he said. "I'm always negotiating," she said. "It's how I know what something is worth." He reached across the table and picked up her pen. He signed the document she'd already drafted. Because of course she'd already drafted it. She'd drafted it 3 weeks ago. She wasn't operating on hope, and he slid it back to her. "Partner," he said. She signed her name next to his. Prentice, she heard later, had fled to BC when the Sudbury business collapsed. He'd thought distance would solve the problem. It didn't. The debt followed him, the way debts do, and by January he was managing inventory at a warehouse in Kelowna and calling himself by his middle name. She didn't feel sorry for him. She thought about it. She gave it a genuine examination, the way she examined everything. And she concluded that she didn't feel sorry for him the same way she didn't feel sorry for a structural deficit. It was a problem that had resolved itself into consequence. The numbers had simply balanced. What she felt, if she was honest, was something closer to clarity. Not happiness exactly, not the uncomplicated kind, but something solid under her feet for the first time in a long time. The particular sensation of knowing where you stand on a balance sheet that you built yourself. Kane's people called her by her full name. Not the accountant, not Prentice's niece, not the woman upstairs, or the one who runs the books. Lena Forsythe, and then later, when the nature of things had made itself clear to everyone, simply Forsythe, the same way they said his name. A shorthand for something that required no further explanation. She kept an office on the 34th floor, the same floor where she'd first waited 40 minutes, and looked at the lake and told herself to note the exits. She still knew where the exits were. She'd never stopped knowing. But she used them differently now, not as an escape route, but as architecture. The knowledge that you could leave is the only thing that makes staying a real choice. She had a desk that faced the window, and a chair that was the right height, and a system that ran the way systems run when someone who genuinely understands them has had enough time to build them properly. The CN Tower still sat in the frame of the glass. The lake still changed color with the weather. In the mornings when the city was quiet, she would bring 2 cups of coffee to the window, and Kane would come to stand beside her, and they would look at the water and not say very much, because they were both people who had learned that most of the important things don't need to be said. She hadn't come here looking for this. She'd come looking for a way to survive the transaction her uncle had made with her name. What she'd found instead was something she hadn't known how to name for a long time, and by the time she had a name for it, it had already been true for months. She'd built a life from the inside out, the same way she built every system. Carefully, with good controls, with redundancy, with full documentation of what everything was worth and where it all stood. And what it was worth, she had concluded, was more than she'd ever thought she'd be able to claim.